This story happened when I was around 17 or 18 years old. It was just my younger brother, my dad, and me. My mother had passed away when my brother was still a baby, but my dad did the best he could to provide for us and make sure we had fun. He always tried to make it to as many family events as his job allowed. One year, he missed Memorial Day, so he promised to make it up to us on Labor Day. Being an angsty teen, I didn't really care, preferring to spend time with friends, but I went along to make my dad and brother happy. We planned to attend the local park festival with vendors and entertainment. We arrived just as the sky was painted with a beautiful dark pink hue. My dad and brother were deep in conversation about band practices and tryouts, while I hung back, scanning the crowd for anyone I might know. Eventually, I lost sight of my dad and brother in the crowd. After what felt like an eternity, I ran into a guy from my math class, and we started talking, causing me to forget about my family. Things were uneventful at first, just a bunch of local vendors selling trinkets. Then, chaos erupted in mere seconds. A loud, shrill scream pierced through the crowd, stopping everything, including the cover band song. I scanned the crowd and saw a circle forming around a middle-aged woman with tear-streaked mascara. Beside her was a familiar red and green shirt. It was my brother. I sprinted over and skidded to a halt next to him, trying to piece together what was happening. The woman was screaming about someone who had shoved her and taken her baby from the car parked near a walking trail. In the confusion, I realized my father had gone after the attacker into the wooded trail. My brother was in shock, unable to speak. Eventually, he mumbled that both the attacker and our dad had guns. Moments later, we heard gunshots. Everyone, including a nearby cop, reacted immediately. An officer approached us, and my brother, urged by the shots, broke his silence. He recounted how my dad had been suspicious of a man lurking in the shadows behind the woman's car. When the woman screamed, my dad had already started walking towards her and told my brother to stay with the lady and wait. The officer handed us over to another cop who offered to drive us home. I wanted to be anywhere but there. During the drive, I tried to keep things normal for my brother, urging him to finish his homework. At home, I couldn't resist turning on the news, hoping for updates. The hours dragged on painfully slow with little information. Finally, after 3 hours, I saw police lights in our driveway. Holding my breath, I watched as another set of headlights pulled up. It was my dad. My brother and I nearly tripped over each other running to hug him. Dad was unharmed, save for some scratches and bruises. After some conversation with the officers, he came inside, and we peppered him with questions. He explained that he had seen the man fleeing with a gun and gave chase. The man stumbled, and my dad fired a warning shot. Realizing he was losing his head start, the man put the baby down and bolted. My dad couldn't catch him as he was focused on the baby. He had been delayed by the need to answer questions and give statements to the police. They eventually caught the guy in the next town over and arrested him, though I never found out what his punishment was. I was maybe 14 or 15 when my dad decided to take me camping for Labor Day one year. This was different from our usual routine since we were more of the beach type, but he wanted to try something new. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I went along with it. As soon as we arrived, I regretted every decision that led me there. My dad had left out the part that this was primitive camping. We only had tents and a cot. This was his version of father-daughter bonding, and while I appreciated the effort, I was more apprehensive about it than he was. Still, I tried to ignore the nagging feeling and have a good time. The first few hours were great. We fished, walked along some trails, and enjoyed the outdoors. As evening approached, we headed back to our campsite and started a fire. Despite the lack of running water or air conditioning, things were going well. We felt secluded, and while it was a bit unnerving, it wasn't awful. By the time the sun was completely gone, we were wiped out. As we settled into our tents, we talked for a while until I could hear my dad snoring peacefully across the way. For some reason, I couldn't fall asleep that night. I lay in silence, staring at the top of my tent, wishing for sleep that wouldn't come. Finally, I must have dozed off because when I woke up, it was pitch black. I listened for my dad but couldn't hear him. Annoyed that I was awake, I tried to listen to the wind outside, but what I heard wasn't the wind. It sounded like whispering, barely audible, but definitely people. I stayed as still as possible, fearing that any movement would give away that I was awake. I tried to hear my dad, worried that something might have happened to him. Taking deep breaths to stay calm, I listened carefully. The whispering was accompanied by the crunching of sticks and leaves, the footsteps loud and offensive against the night air. People were walking around the campsite, whispering among themselves. After about 30 minutes, I heard the voices and footsteps recede. When I felt it was safe, I poked my head out of the tent zipper and saw my dad's tent undisturbed. I slowly made my way over and found him sleeping, completely unfazed. I whispered his name until he woke up and told him what I'd heard. My dad, always level-headed, tried to reassure me that everything was fine and that I must have been dreaming. He insisted that if someone had been outside, he would have known. Exhausted and shaken, I listened to him, but decided to sleep in his tent that night. Even with my dad nearby, every little noise spooked me. A rogue leaf hitting the tent would jolt me awake. This continued all night until the sun finally illuminated everything, easing my fears. The next morning, I got up before my dad and searched the campsite for any proof of what I'd heard. I looked for footprints, missing items, anything to show my dad, and avoid another night out there. After nearly an hour, the only thing I found was a carving of a crescent moon in a tree near the edge of the campsite. Disappointed, I tried to let it go. The rest of the day continued as usual, and reluctantly, I agreed to stay another night since we were leaving the next day. That night, I resolved to stay awake. I alternated between reading by flashlight and lying in the dark, feeling uneasy. My goal was to survive the night and leave bright and early. Around 11 p.m., I heard the familiar footsteps from the night before. This time, there was no whispering. The steps were silent, creeping through the site. After several minutes, the sound stopped and there was silence. Thinking they had left, I started to relax and tried to peek outside, but nothing was there. I settled back in, thinking the scare was over. Then, without warning, my tent walls nearly collapsed in on me. Hands pressed through the fabric, trying to grab me, accompanied by creepy cackling laughter. I screamed, a full-on, blood-curdling scream. I shot out of the tent and saw my dad's tent flaps open, but he was nowhere around. Feeling unsafe, I took off into the woods. Thankfully, the trail was well lit, and I knew where we had parked. I sprinted toward the car, ignoring the pain in my side. When I finally reached the parking lot, I saw someone at my dad's car. Hesitantly, I got closer and relaxed when I saw it was my dad. He couldn't understand what I was saying at first since my words were slurred together. I kept repeating that we were in danger. My dad, however, was calm and explained he had gone to the truck for Advil. Then he peered behind me. When I turned, I saw two men in masks. I froze as my dad tried to challenge them, which was strange. I tried to get him to stop, but he ignored me. After a few moments, one of the men grabbed my dad by the collar, and I heard him struggle. I started to cry, but then the struggling noises stopped, replaced by laughter. The masked man abruptly let go of my dad, and both he and the other man doubled over in laughter. I stood stunned until the masks came off. It was my uncle. I was livid and still crying, now from rage. My dad was in on the whole charade. Apparently, I had made a comment months prior that I wouldn't make stupid decisions in a horror movie. This was my dad's way of proving me wrong. It took a long time for me to forgive my dad and uncle. We've never gone camping again.